Hey, it's Steve. Well, I'm getting ready to start the wiring on the 2x4 foot N scale project layout, and so in this video, I'm going to run through all of the tools and supplies I normally use on my wiring projects. Let's take a look. Okay, so here's a collection of all the supplies and tools I normally use on my wiring projects. Now, this isn't everything. I mean, there are some other random things that I might have to use for different projects. And obviously, you're going to need things like screwdrivers, and I'm not going to cover those types of sort of regular tools that aren't specialized to wiring. These are really just things that you're going to use mostly just for your wiring projects. So a lot of stuff here, we'll go through things one by one, and then I'll actually use some of them to kind of give you an idea of how they're actually used. So first off, obviously, is a soldering iron. Now, there are ways you can get around not having to use a soldering iron, but for the most part, this is something that you're going to need. I have this Hakko one, which works really well. There's all kinds of soldering irons out there. You don't really need anything too complicated, but what I like about this one is that it does allow you to adjust the temperature, and that can be really handy. Most soldering irons that are cheaper, they just have, they're on or they're off. There's not really any control of temperature. And that's really fine for most things, but if you do a lot of wide variety of electronics wiring, say you're trying to solder something to a decoder, or you're just trying to solder, some heavier gauge wire, having the ability to change your temperatures can be a nice feature. But again, it's not something you need to have. Any basic soldering iron is going to work for most of your wiring needs. And having a base like this is also handy, so you can just have somewhere to store your soldering iron, so when it's on, it's not laying there and possibly rolling into something and catching it on fire and that kind of stuff. But again, you don't necessarily need this for every project, but obviously a tool that you're going to want to have at some point. Now, it's possible you won't need extra wire, but for example, I use a lot of these Kato terminal rail joiners just to save time. And these have a lot of wire built into them, and a lot of times you don't need the whole thing, and you can cut it off and you can save your extra wire. And so you may not have to actually go out and buy a spool of wire, but I have a bunch of wire. I have this spool here, for example. But what's really nice are these boxes of wire I have here. These actually just contain a bunch of reels of different colors of wire in there. And having a variety of wire, this is a little bit heavier gauge, and the same thing, different colors. Having different colored wire is super helpful for your projects, because if you have a lot of wiring going on, maybe you're wiring up track, you're wiring up turnouts, you have lighted structures, maybe you have some type of sound system, whatever else you might have going on with your layout, maybe just LEDs for a control panel. Being able to distinguish which wire goes to what is critical. So you want to know for sure that a pair of wires is going to track power and it's not going to a turnout, or it's not going to an LED light and you're going to suddenly send 16 volts to a 3-volt LED, and that kind of thing. So being able to color coordinate your wiring so you can keep track of, okay, the blue and white wires are for track and the red and black wires are for your LED lighting, and green and yellow are your turnout controls, or whatever it might be. Just being able to pick a color, doesn't matter what the color is. Just pick some colors for a certain type of wiring and then use it exclusively on a given project, so you don't mix up things. So multiple colors of wire, certainly very helpful. Buying a bunch of wire obviously is something that can be very helpful for your long-term projects. I forgot to mention this earlier, but obviously you're going to need some solder. This is a very thin solder. You can get thicker solder, and really it just depends what you're doing. If you're doing any kind of circuit boards, you're going to need some pretty thin solder. You're not going to want to have this really thick solder spool of solder that's going to just spread solder all over your project and make a mess. So getting a spool of this can last you, this will last years and years and years. And so obviously something you'll definitely need to pick up for your projects. Now, also going along the lines of wires, you need something to cut and strip the wires. So I have two types of wire strippers here. They're basically the same, they work the same, but this is for thinner gauge wires. It goes from 20 to 30. This is really designed more for heavier gauge wire. And really for model railroad projects, you're going to be using something like this that does 20, 22, 24 gauge wire. And that is certainly very helpful to have. Now in a pinch, you can just use a pair of nippers like this. and strip some wire. You know, obviously you can cut the wire like that, but you can kind of just half squeeze and strip off wire with a pair of nippers like this. And I do that a lot. And it's fine when you have stranded wire like this, but if you have a solid wire, you'll end up more times than not nicking the wire with these, and then when you try to bend the wire, it breaks. And so if you have solid wire that's not a bunch of little strands like this one, these can be really frustrating to use. And so you want to have a pair of wire strippers, really, and that makes your life a whole lot easier. So now this is 22 gauge wire, and so if you want to use these wire strippers, you basically just put the wire in the 22 there, and it comes off super easy. It's perfectly sized to cut through the insulation, not cut the wire, and it makes life a whole lot easier to have a good pair of wire strippers. So definitely get one of these. They're not that expensive. I think I got these from Micromark, but you can get similar ones at Home Depot even. But definitely very, very important to make your wiring a whole lot easier. One more thing here that can be useful is a brush. This is a brush that has these brass bristles in it. And so they're just stiff brass bristles. And this can be used for cleaning a metal object that you want to solder. You know, a lot of times with something you're trying to solder it, you get a little bit of oxidation on the metal, and that makes it really hard to get the solder to stick. And so if you scratch it up a little bit, kind of just buff off that layer of oxidation, your solder will stick a lot easier. So you don't always need to use this. In fact, most of the time you won't need it, but it is nice to have because there are times where you just really need something like this to scuff up whatever you're working on to get that solder to adhere well. So definitely a very cheap tool, but something that can be very handy to have. Now, another thing you might consider using are these Quick-splice or Scotch-lock connectors, and I've never really been a fan of these. They do seem to work really well for people that have used them, but I've always been a little bit leery of you know, the wires being able to come undone, and so I usually just go ahead and solder everything. But then I came across these T-tab wire connectors. I've never used these before, but these are really intriguing to me, and I think I might go ahead and buy some of these and use these on a later project. I don't think I'll use them on my 2x4 foot layout project because I don't really need a bus line with a lot of leads and stuff connecting into it because it's you know, such a small layout. But this might be something that could be really handy for a larger layout for doing really fast wire connections. So something to take a look at. Now, the last thing here before I go through some demos is basically insulation. So I have, this is just a bag of different types of tubing that you can put on your wiring, just longer lengths of it. This is essentially the same thing in here, different varieties of tubing, different thicknesses. These are super, super handy. Anytime you're making a solder joint, you want to insulate that joint so you don't have a short. You know, you don't want to have two solder joints touching each other and causing a short and all kinds of problems. So with this tubing, basically, you're going to slide it on the wire before you make your solder joint. A lot of times I forget, and that's why I use the other materials I'll show you here. And then you can make your wire connection, and then you slide your tubing over your wire joint. You heat it up with a lighter or something like that. It shrinks down, crimps onto your connection, and then you have a nice, secure wire joint that won't get shorted out. However, again, a lot of times you forget to put this on the wiring before you do the solder joint, and then you can't go back and do it. And so you can either use electrical tape, you can basically pull off a piece, wrap it around your wire joint, and that can give you a nice insulated joint. And this works fine, it works well. It does have some downsides. One is that the tape obviously can fail over time, so maybe 5 years down the road, you just start losing the stickiness of the tape and it starts to maybe unwind a little bit. And then you might find yourself in a scenario where you do get a short circuit, you know, 10 years down the road from when you did the wiring because the tape just lost its stickiness and fell off, and then all of a sudden you have an exposed wire joint. What I like to use more often is liquid electrical tape. It looks similar to this. It's a black, goopy liquid, and you can just paint this on your wire connection, and it will put a nice vinyl coating on your wire joint that is going to be there forever pretty much. And so this works really, really well. The downside, of course, is that, well, it smells. That's kind of a downside for sure. But you have to make sure that you've coated everything well. And so a lot of times you have to go back and do 2 coatings because it is a liquid. And so this might kind of run towards one side of your connection or the other, depending on how the wires are oriented. And you have to go back and touch it up again. So always plan on putting this on twice. just to make sure you have good coverage. But it's really handy because you can put it wherever you want. It's going to stick on there. It's not going to peel off in 5 years like the tape might or something like that. And so it's super handy to have. And I do definitely like using this for sealing off all of my wire joints if I don't use the heat shrink tubing, which I always try to use. But again, sometimes you just forget to put it on or you don't have the right size. And so having the liquid tape can be a really handy lifesaver when you're trying to insulate your wire joints. So anyway, let's just go through an example or two of how I actually do my soldering, how I do the shrink tubing, and how you can use this to remove solder from a joint. With stranded wire, you want to make sure you always have the wire twisted together so you don't have little individual strands poking out at a weird angle that might eventually present a problem for something shorting out. So normally at this point you need to get your heat shrink tubing on before you connect your wires physically. Of course, obviously with this sample I can always put it on from the other end, but normally you couldn't do that. You always want to make sure you have a strong physical connection when you're connecting wires together. So some people will just kind of twist them like this, but that's not really ideal. I like to cross them 90 degrees and then twist each wire around the opposite wire like so, and then fold both in towards the middle and squeeze that together. So you end up with something kind of like this, if I can get it in focus. And so you want to have that nice and neat looking before you even try to solder anything. So make sure everything is pressed down together and you have a strong physical connection before you apply the solder when you're connecting wires. So if you pull them apart, they actually will stay together. And you're not relying solely on the solder to prevent everything from coming apart. So now when you're applying the solder, there's two things you can do. Normally you just apply the soldering iron from one side, the solder to the other, let it flow together, and that's the way you can normally do things. However, sometimes because I don't have enough hands, I will actually take a piece of solder, cut it off, and I will actually wrap the solder into the wire connection, sometimes twisting it in right from the start. So it's actually embedded in there. And then you can come back with the soldering iron and melt the solder into the joint. And that just, saves you a hand. So instead of having to like hold the wire, hold the solder, hold the soldering iron, you can just worry about holding the wire and the soldering iron. See, then we can just melt the solder directly into the joint like that without having to hold the solder up to the joint. So that just saves you a hand, that's all. Now, the thing to be careful though, if you do that, don't do it with it directly over you because sometimes a chunk of hot solder will fall off. So make sure that you don't have anything below it that might burn if the solder falls off. So anyway, with the solder joint complete, you can just slide your heat shrink tubing over the joints. And usually the easiest way is to take a lighter, run the flame underneath it. Try not to actually burn it, but and it will shrink down, as you can see, really well. So at that point, you now have a very nice, neat looking wire connection that is strong. And so it's going to just be a good connection for you. So that's pretty much how you can do your soldering and do your wire connections. Let's just pretend this was a solder joint. I didn't put my heat shrink tubing on because I forgot. And so we'll just put some solder on there. Okay, so we have a connection with some solder on it. And so I like to use the liquid electrical tape. And so this is very easy to use. It can be messy though, so you have to make sure it doesn't drip on anything, but you can just apply your coating of the liquid tape on there, and then you're pretty much good to go. You, again, always come back and do 2 coats with this though, because you can kind of see a little bit, there's one spot there where the coverage just isn't very good. Make sure you come back, do a 2nd coat. 2 coats will usually always have you fully covered, and you'll be really good in terms of having a good insulated joint. So easy way to insulate all your wire joints after the fact if you forgot to put on your heat shrink tubing. So one product you may or may not try to pick up is this actual solder wick. And this is sort of just a braided wire kind of thing. And it basically will kind of be a place for your solder to get soaked up into. So if you need to remove solder from a connection, this can help you do that. And this is really more for doing electronics. If you need to remove components from a board that you had soldered on, you have to get the solder off so you can pull off whatever you're trying to remove. This is the way to do that. So you don't usually need this. And I don't really have a good example of anything, but I have this old circuit board here. And say I want to remove this resistor over here. Well, to do that, I have to basically remove the solder from the bottom. All you need to do is basically put this in between the soldering iron and where the solder is, and this will basically absorb some of that solder and help you get to where you can remove a lot of it. You can kind of see that it's getting wicked into the soldering wick thing here, and now that solder is removed. You can kind of see how this turns silver as it soaks up all the solder. But most of the solder is removed. I may not be able to get it off still. Yep, it's off now. Okay, so I was able to remove that resistor, and most of the solder now is removed from those connections on the board. It's probably kind of hard to see that. But this can be a helpful thing for removing solder from circuit boards if you have to do anything like that for an electronics project. So getting some of this solder wick can be pretty handy. So maybe you're trying to wire a decoder and you just kind of got a blob of solder that crossed multiple connections, and you have to remove it so everything will work right. And then you can use this to basically soak up all the solder as you heat it up to remove it, and then be back to a clean circuit board again, and then start over. So there are occasional times when this will come in really handy, but overall, it's not something that you're going to need very often. So anyway, I hope that helped you out. That wasn't by any means, covering all of the available wiring tools and supplies you might want to use. But at least for your basic model railroad wiring, those tools and supplies should really cover most of your needs. But anyway, that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.